All right, everybody, we're ready to go. We've got an array of school leaders here tonight, along with just doing some presenting. Our dean, who will introduce here in a moment, but our chancellor just joined us. Obviously, probably running recently. He's got his running shoes on. As you know, our governor always wears tennis shoes. But let me introduce our chancellor. Relatively new to the job, but it moves so quickly it's hard to tell. Jeremy Chancellor Hefner. Thank you.
Thank you, Floyd. It's my delight to, of course, welcome all our community members for what will be another very thought-provoking, probably very entertaining session here with two of our great, fantastic leaders here that really, I think, frame the political dialogue both nationally and internationally for us in very exciting ways. I'm so glad that the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies sponsors these kinds of events and, of course, works with the Office of Global Engagement as well to make sure that the community is pulled in and really intellectually stimulated by what are really, I think, current and, as again, thought-provoking topics. Today's one is a great one as we begin the countdown for the 2020 election here. The school is led by a brand new dean, and I have the privilege of quickly introducing our new dean of the Korbel School of International Studies. Dr. Frederick Meyer comes to us from Duke University, where he was known as an international scholar in public policy. He is incredibly excited to bring in the international and the public policy together in really new and exciting ways. The Korbel School is home to our new Scribner Institute for Public Policy. That will be, I think, a real transformational new institute that really will propel us forward in the public policy space and integrate so nicely with our international education efforts and the research that our terrific faculty do in the Korbel School. So please give a warm welcome to Dean Fritz Meyer, who will introduce our speakers here.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I think I'm mic'd up, so thank you so much, Chancellor Hefner. And warm welcome to all of you. It's a terrific turnout, and we're very honored to be hosting this, I guess, another in a series of these kinds of events. It is, what are we, we're 1 year out?
Who's counting?
I don't know about you, but I'm already exhausted, and this is going to be one heck of a ride. I mean, it's hard to even think of a moment where we've had quite as many things in play. I mean, every election, of course, is said, this is the most important election of your lifetime, etc. So this one might be coming up. But it is just an extraordinary moment. I mean, all of the things that are going on domestically. I think there's some kind of process going on in the Congress right now. I've read something about, golly, I mean, we had an election on Tuesday, and there's that to talk about. So a million things happening at home, and of course internationally, between what is happening in Syria and with Turkey and the Kurds, the ongoing issues in Korea, China pressing on multiple fronts. Other than that, it's a pretty quiet year. And but tonight we're gonna sort out what all of that means for the election, and indeed the other side, what the election might mean for both at home and abroad. What's at stake in the 2020 election. My job is to stay out of the way, largely, because we have two fantastic experts who probably really don't need an introduction, but Floyd Cerulli, who is, I think you probably all know who Floyd is, but a longtime pollster and commentator in the Colorado scene. also head of a center here, the Crossley Center for Public Opinion, professor teaching here at the Korbel School. And Floyd will sort of handle the domestic side of this. And then, of course, Ambassador Professor Chris Hill, who, again, as you all know, he really doesn't need an introduction, but really in many ways the Dean of American Foreign Policy Professionals, lifetime of service in some of the most dramatic places in the world, I would say, in the Balkans, in Korea, Assistant Secretary of State, and an incredibly distinguished record, including being my predecessor here as Dean at the Korbel School. So please join me in welcoming the two of them, and then I'll turn it over to Floyd Cerullo.
Thank you, Dean. The opening slide, as you can see, lists us, and that presentation there, I think Dean was, Ambassador, was the night after the 2016 election. And we were just describing that to Fritz. Everybody came in a little glassy-eyed. It had been a hard night before. And I, of course, spent Wednesday changing lots of my slides because the expectations were a little different. But it set off what is now, I think, probably about our fourth effort at this. We do it at least once a year after each election, but we also periodically do it within it. We're going to take about, I think, maybe an hour or an hour and 10 minutes on discussion. We will, once we're done, we'll have a little discussion between the three of us and then take your questions. So I want to reassure you, we definitely want to get the questions. And as you can see, my topics are pretty much the things we're thinking about a lot and the things that we know are going to affect this election. And that's kind of what I'm focusing on, as is the dean or the ambassador. I've got a couple of deans here. Yeah. And then Chris is, he'll start, we just came up with this list, he came up with it actually, and whatever is probably his most current topic. I know you were on MSNBC maybe today, probably.
Morning, yeah.
Exactly. You can see him pretty regularly. I thought I'd start with a topic in which I did not have a slide on this in a presentation that I was preparing prior to October 11th, another political event we've had here, and a number of you were at that event. Also, I didn't have that picture available. That is now an iconic picture, sort of like when the President Obama was with his national security team watching the capture, well, not capture, but the tracking down of Mr. Osama bin Laden. This picture we will remember. Both the president tweeted it, but I think that was maybe a mistake because my view is, and of course so did Nancy Pelosi, but my view is that this is a picture we're going to remember for a long time, and I think he's going to remember it. I just put up the polls that are most recent. 538 puts them up. That's Nate Silver's site. And as you can see, in favor of the inquiry, about 51%. In a state poll here, it was about 54%. And removal is around, and that's an average. You'll see some that are at 50% or even 51% or higher. A recent Colorado poll said it was 56% here in Colorado. But on average, it's about 48. In other words, about half the public is in favor of removal. And I think Nancy Pelosi would like that to be 55%. And to some extent, that's what these hearings are all about, is to bring that forward and let the public decide. The president has a very tight range of approval. It's been maybe seldom lower than 40, maybe 39 once in a while, and it never goes above 45. And at the moment, it's about 44. And you know, impeachment's been on. The process has been on for several weeks now, and it hasn't moved. There's the recorded vote on the procedures. You remember, not a single Republican voted for it. All the Dems, except for 3, voted in favor of it. So my headline is, Donald Trump will be indicted. That is to say, she needs 218 points, or they need 218 points once it gets through the Judiciary Committee with most likely some 2 or 3 charges, and I think it'll get those 218. I am not of the view that it'll pass the Senate yet, but we can talk about that. That might be one of our topics. Obviously, public opinion would be a factor. Go ahead.
I'd like to make some international comments on the impeachment issue, but I
Yeah,
don't want
please
to
do.
derail your
No,
train
no,
of
go ahead.
thought. Are
Go
we-
ahead.
All right. I think anyone who's been abroad lately, of course, everyone is kind of fascinated. What will happen? Is this really? And there's this fundamental lack of understanding of when you have the word impeachment, it really means indictment, and then you, of course, have to have conviction in the Senate, and you can imagine these being a elusive concept when you're overseas or for people overseas. But I think it's fair to say that most foreign observers of this, especially people who don't follow it with perhaps the granularity that we do, see this as a process that weakens the president. And for some people who feel that the president, they'd like the president to be weak and they'd like him to be sort of out of their issues, whether it's in Europe or whatever, they don't mind that. But there are a lot of parts of the world, and I was just in the Balkans, where they would like to see much more U.S. engagement, and they look at this and they say, well, they ain't going to get it. And in fact, when I was in Albania and Macedonia, and it was amazing. They were going on and on about this president who knows nothing about the Balkans, who just makes these capricious decisions and has really made a mess of things for Albania and Macedonia. And they're talking about President Macron of France, who just kind of came out of nowhere to say, you know, his staff said, okay, this is what we're doing today. We're going to bring these 2 new countries. We're going to give them dates for accession talks into the European Union. In the case of Macedonia, they insisted that Macedonia change its name to North Macedonia so that it would be less offensive to the Greeks or something. So the Macedonians they did this, but with the thought that this was going to be followed quickly by NATO membership, and it was, but also, more importantly for people's pocketbooks, followed quickly by a European Union decision. Albania was expecting the same thing because they didn't want to just leave Albania in the rear and promote Macedonia. And then on the 15th, they had this European Council meeting, and you can kind of picture the scene. Macron's looking at Brexit and how to deal with Boris Johnson and, you know, what to do about some of these non-democratic states that have kind of coalesced on the eastern flank there. And then someone said, now, Mr. President, we're going to discuss the accession date for Albania. And you can imagine Macron said, no. You know, ça suffit. I mean, that's enough. And so Macron now, by saying no, he's actually added to his burden because there's a lot of issues now. But from the point of view of how they look at the U.S., they see a weakened president, and some of them would just assume, and they asked me a lot about what's going to happen in the election. So I said I have to check with Floyd before I give you an answer.
As Chris points out in a brand new article, which you can find online, and also I assume it's in the Hill. Well,
It's in Project Syndicate, but we gave it to all the friends of our school here, so we'll know who you are then. Yeah.
Right toward embedded within it, he also points out that while, as he points out, they're concerned about a weakened president, there was no indication that this president was actually sort of particularly knowledgeable about it or focused on it or going to do anything about it. But I think that's a good point, and it's absolutely correct. Let me do the numbers you see quite often. This is also from, well, actually, this is from RealClearPolitics.com, and it's the November 5th. And the first column, as you can see, is the national polls right now. And Mr. Biden has been, he's been at 35, and he's been also at 25, and he's about 30 right now. And because every new poll, not every, but most new polls get factored into this, and this is an average, typically of the maybe most recent 7 or 8 polls. And so as you can see, there's the top 3 that get all the attention. Mr. Buttigieg has been moving up, but Ms. Harris, it has really been dropping down, and Yang just sort of hangs in there. And Klobuchar has also holding her own, but not going up. And then the rest is really are people that have slid down. And there's Michael Bennet, who is just announced that he's going to stay in this through New Hampshire. He just filed in New Hampshire. And hoping for, sort of a miracle out there. The thought would be that if the party began looking for an alternative, looking for a new face, if there was some upset in Iowa, who knows? But that's what he's sort of hanging in there. Notice Iowa. Warren is ahead in Iowa. Again, these polls move a great deal. They're very nationalized, and they don't get very many polls there, so that'll probably stay for a while. There's New Hampshire. As you can see, she's ahead in New Hampshire at the moment, and she's in a tie there with Biden in California, which is on the same day as our primary on March 3rd. This will start, Iowa will start February 3rd, which I will show you here in a moment. The next debate is in Atlanta on the 20th. I will no doubt suffer through it. But it's not as big a crowd as it has been. So that's good news there.
It's interesting if you look at the southern states, say South Carolina, for example, a little different demographic than those other states. Biden, really is
You
way
got, if I had
ahead.
put up, as he points out, if I had put up South Carolina, he's probably 50 points ahead.
Yeah, he's way ahead.
I think there'll be a number of states, which kind of suggests something we'll talk about here in a second, and that is how long may this last. My sense is that Biden, if he can hang in these early states, which will be difficult, it could end up the way it was in 08 or with Hillary in both cases, in 08 and Hillary in 16, and that is it took a long time. It was a long battle. Obviously, she didn't win in 08, but it was decided practically in the last primaries. There are the people that have dropped out there. Yeah.
Can I just ask I'm asking a question because I really don't know the answer, but I'll put it in terms of a statement. In Iowa, that number represents intended caucus goers.
That's correct.
And as intended caucus goers now in November, you're not really sure what that number means.
Absolutely.
Because what will really come into play is the organizational capacity of the campaigns, the number of minivans they can hire in order to schlep people to said caucuses.
Right.
So I would call the Iowa numbers soft.
Oh yeah,
And then,
they're all soft.
but what's interesting about New Hampshire is the fact that I'm from New England, and I know that in New Hampshire, if you're from another party and you think there's nothing going on in your party, you can cross over and vote in the Democratic primary, and I'm not sure the numbers in New Hampshire capture the number of Republicans who won't bother voting in the New Hampshire primary for the Republicans. It's the same night, and will instead vote for among the Democrats.
And I think it's he points out a challenge of public opinion polling in these primaries, and that's also true in Iowa. It is very difficult. There are some people with good track records and methodology, but really knowing who's going to show up at a caucus 3 months down the road is, and the weather and all the rest of it is not easy. But that is the layout at the moment. You'll notice the next, there is going to be a debate. There's going to be maybe 3 more debates, but after the one in Atlanta, there'll be one in December at UCLA. So those are going to affect those numbers. Age is obviously, it's gotten quite a bit of discussion. I just put this slide up to show that us old baby boomers are hanging in there, and a few, I guess, a silent generation, that would be over 75, 74. But also, I didn't realize, because Nancy's sort of third in line if something would happen to Mr. Pence and Trump. She's, and also, there could be a spontaneous convention where for the first time they go to the floor and they're looking for somebody because it's gridlocked, and I've got Nancy on my list there. Jimmy Carter, who happens to be 96 and, as you know, is still out building houses, and he made a little statement about a month and a half ago that maybe we ought to have an age limit. But he's to some extent proof that, boy, you can do a lot of things at a very old age.
He could run again.
He could run again.
By the way, I was at the New York, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations. They had me moderate a discussion with the Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir, who's 94. So my first question was, do you think Joe Biden's too young to be president? And he said, well, it kind of depends.
Notice that Reagan was 77 when he left office in '88.
Yeah.
So with we're at an old age here. Of course, we spend all of our time talking about millennials and Gen Xers. And in point of fact, even in this election here in Colorado, they were a minor part of it. The election was overwhelmingly dominated by 500,000 baby boomers who showed up. I put this map up because I wanted you to see something that Larry Sabato does. He's a very good poli-sci professor at UVA, Virginia, and it just reminds all of us that when you see these national polls that show Biden 10 points up over the president, or Sanders, or Warren, that's got a lot of people that are not so important. That is to say, it's going to have not an oversampling, but an overrepresentation of California, of New York, of New Jersey, of Illinois. And what's really important is just a handful of those those blue states and the yellow states, if you're mainly interested in how this election is going to turn out. And notice this is a count that he did in maybe late September, so it does change, his electoral change, because he'll look at the latest polls in those states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, et cetera. And that's where he'll then put those and put them in their color ranking and add up the Electoral College. But the point is, it's close.
It's seriously close.
And North Carolina will be another one that as you can see, it leans Republican. But that's not to say it's not going to be battled for. I think Georgia will be battled for. I think Florida will be battled for. Ohio, Illinois, and Iowa. And I don't think Texas so much, but because I've seen some late polls there, and it's not Democrats are not very strong there. But nonetheless, the history of it suggests it would.
Floyd, what did you make of the New York Times had the big spread earlier this week with the 6 key pivotal states, and at least their polling suggests it's absolute knife's edge. Biden slightly ahead.
Right.
But right on the knife's edge, and Warren and Sanders losing to Trump.
And that's
in the swing states. So.
My first little point was on these national polls, and it just points out what Fritz is saying, and that is it's individual state polls and then doing an aggregate, because that's kind of what happened on election night in 2016. We had been looking at national polls that had Hillary Clinton up by 4 or 5 points. She indeed won by more than 2 million votes, and she lost because she lost by 77,000 votes in 3 states, right? 3 states that are still they're very much contested right here. So that's absolutely right. And it also points out what Fritz just said, and that is, by and large, what the polls indicate is that there is a tremendous number of people, particularly in those states, but also just sort of people that voted for Trump and are giving it another thought, because those are the people you want. They might have voted for Obama at some point, but in any event, they're really getting tired of his behavior as much as anything else, and they have to have a good alternative. And they keep telling these polls that Ms. Warren, at least at this point, Ms. Warren and Mr. Sanders are unacceptable to them, and they will stay with Trump, which would be, kind of unbelievable. Only Biden, right at the moment, his problem, of course, he's got to get through these primaries, but only Biden at the moment is consistently ahead. Did you have a?
I just wanted to ask Fritz, because Fritz, I know you've looked at a lot of frankly, the apportionment of votes in these southern states. For years, we've been told, oh, Texas, it's becoming the new California. It's going to be much more up for grabs. We sure didn't see that in 2016. People said the same thing about Georgia. And of course, they did have a really close governor race, which, I don't know, kind of surprised me. Alabama did elect a Democrat, although he was up against a known rapist who got 49% of the vote. I'm not from Alabama.
That is a strategy. Well, you look what's just happened to Virginia, and so for a long, long time we thought Virginia was a red state. Now this is suburban D.C. and it's a very different place. I just came from North Carolina, and North Carolina has always been a very purple state. Voted for Obama the first time out, for example. So on the knife's edge, I think the trend is probably in the direction that people say in Texas and Georgia, but it is a slow process. And Trump's support is strong in the Deep South. It's just very strong. So I don't see it changing.
But Florida, which is always the the big question mark. I mean, that just gets a tremendous influx of people, often Democrats, whether Hispanic or Northeasterners. And so Florida might be much more up for grabs.
I think Florida's up for grabs. I think if North Carolina goes for the Democrat, then the Democrats won in a landslide.
I
think
agree.
Florida's more
Yeah.
of a swing state.
Yeah.
in that
And of course, they
regard.
got one more vote, as you know. The president moved down there. We're assuming he'll vote for himself.
There you go.
All right, to focus on, just to kind of continue on the presidential politics, here's the schedule. I mentioned Iowa. Then 1 week later, New Hampshire. And if you remember, Obama wins Iowa, he loses New Hampshire. Hillary, remember, she came back. She had her sort of epiphany moment, and everybody, she had a lot of support. Who knows, maybe there were some Republicans supporting her, but in any event, she came back. And then the battle was on and stayed on for a very long period of time. We're March 3rd, Super Tuesday, and as you can see, we're with North Carolina, which will get a lot of attention at that point simply because of the size. California, which is so hard to campaign in, it's so expensive, and we're going to get some attention. Also very large is Texas.
Is super more super this year than in the past?
A little bit,
Because
a
we
little
see
bit.
Colorado added
Yeah.
to the, so it's added a couple of states, is that the?
Yeah, right. And it's always been sort of one of the big events. And I guess one of my observations would be that what happens in Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina, and as Fritz pointed out at the moment, probably the strongest state, the two strongest states for Biden is Nevada and South Carolina. Those will start shaping things because I think some people start dropping out. They simply don't have the resources or the money, or they don't get any attention. So to the extent these polls people are still showing up for these debates because they've got 3%. If you don't make your caucus that night, where you get 15% in a caucus, or if you're not on that poll, that primary list, the top 5 or so, you're probably out fairly quickly.
I mean, it's amazing. Every year we think, this year will be different. Maybe we'll have an old-fashioned convention and it'll go all the way to the end. But in fact, the process every time winnows people pretty quickly. And I'd be surprised if on the morning of the 4th of March we don't pretty much know.
I mean,
where this is gonna go.
California's in Super Tuesday
Yeah.
now. That
We're-
used to
we're
be
gonna
in
know.
June, sort of
Yeah.
after the event.
That's right.
I think I agree with that. I think on March the 4th, we will have this down to maybe 3. I'm not convinced we will have decided yet. I think there might be a couple of people representing the moderate lane and the more progressive lane. I don't think they're going to go away. I think that battle is going to continue for a while.
They won't drop out. I agree with that.
Right.
But I will bet you I'll know pretty. I'd be willing to bet on the 4th that I know.
You can
the
see we may
nominee.
have
Yeah.
a session. We
Yeah.
may do a
That's
session
good. We'll
on
have-
March
we'll-
the 4th where
I think we scheduled
we
that,
get
right?
together and
Yeah,
talk about that.
Yeah.
And then there's Colorado on the Senate side, and that is our primary is our state primary is on June the 30th, and that'll decide if Mr. Hickenlooper is the Democratic nominee. We're assuming Cory Gardner is the Republican nominee. He's one never knows. You can always get a late challenge, but it starts a couple of days after the Super Tuesday. And that's where caucuses start, and that's where our process starts. Maybe a couple of 100,000 people, maybe more, but not about that many, will show up on the Democratic side, go to their caucus, and begin that process to decide if they go, what happens in the state convention, who gets on the ballot. As you know, there's a pretty extensive list of people thinking about running, and with Hickenlooper and Romanoff leading it up. One question that Hickenlooper will have to think about is, does he want to avoid the caucuses, and does he want to just petition on? If you remember in the last campaign, both Mr. Polis and Mr. Stapleton petitioned. They then went back and got into the process, and because Polis did both, and when he got the threshold he needed at the convention, he just went that way. And as you remember, Walker Stapleton, his petitions didn't work out, and he ended up walking to the convention and getting on that way. But I'm just sort of pointing out to you that we haven't have probably seen the final conclusion here as to how they're going to approach it. But most people go through the party process, and I'll be surprised if Hickenlooper doesn't. But as you know, he's the front runner. There's Cory. One of the three most, we've got North Carolina up there. Mr. Tillis is on this list of people that are toss-up seats. And then you can see, this is again Mr. Sabato's crystal ball, he calls it. He does it about every 2 or 3 months. And it's a nice map, and I use it a lot. I'll be taking it to San Francisco for a polling conference here shortly. And it gives you some idea that Colorado, everybody knows that Colorado is going to be incredibly tight. And to some extent, it corresponds, Corey's problem, it corresponds to that previous map I showed you, Donald Trump. Every poll shows that he's running about 10 points behind here. And so consequently, the nationalization of politics has sort of made maybe a 90% correspondence to how you vote for president to how you vote for the Senate. And so consequently, he has to run with his president. And that is going to be difficult in Colorado unless something dramatically changes or the Democratic Party picks somebody wrong. Go ahead.
The Senate is, I mean, it's 3 seats, right? Net 3 seats.
Right.
That make all the difference.
You got it, 53 to
I mean, the other one is
47.
that I would argue is Susan Collins in Maine. I think she's more vulnerable than that map suggests. But
That's interesting because
in
you're
Alabama,
probably right.
It's going to be offset by Alabama, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Alabama, the Democrats have to pick up 4 because they're going to lose, or they assume
That is correct.
they're going to. As you know, Mr. Sanders just, our
Sessions.
Mr. Sessions just got in it. Thank you, sir. And with the blessing of the president, maybe not. No, okay, but that who knows if that's bad or good? You know, it's
So
probably.
I have a question. I mean, if I'm Cory Gardner, whose picture you've actually put on the slide, I would be thinking the president needs him more than he needs the president, because I think sidling up to the president in Colorado is maybe not good politics. And the concern he has apparently is if he backs off from the president doesn't support him, but the
Right.
president absolutely needs him.
Yeah.
And so why does Cory Gardner think Trump holds the cards when it seems to me he holds the cards?
You know, that's a way
Or
of
am I
looking
just
at
sounding like his opponent or something? I mean, I don't get it.
You know, I think it's impossible for him to decouple. Number one, he needs the enthusiasm of the Trump vote. And even though he's behind in the state, Republicans are 85%, 90%.
Well, they're not going
in
to
favor of
stay
it.
home and let the Democrats take another seat.
True, but I think he is concerned whether, how will they turn out? But I don't disagree with you. I think his other problem is that this is a fairly easy state to get a primary opponent. And he also has to, all these senators, not all of them, but most of them, one reason why I don't see impeachment going anywhere is just a lot of these people could have primaries. Our primary is until the 30th of June, obviously well after impeachment's decided. In my opinion, between now and then, he's going to be as loyal as possible. Would he maybe take your advice after that, at a point in which he feels he can't be challenged? Possibly.
I
and
mean,
some
there's
of the
a
others.
certain point in the spring he can't be challenged. So why doesn't he pick that point and then just go after Trump in the certain knowledge that Trump supporters will vote for him anyway, because they know, as Fritz said, they may well lose Susan Collins. There are a lot of Democrats furious at her. And I was just in Maine a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was writing her off. So I mean, this is not.
Yeah. And Sabato uses, you know, whatever the latest polls are, not necessarily kind of the anecdotal on the ground type of evidence. But I think that's a good point, and I think that's the debate that Cory is having on an incredibly regular basis, is exactly, but by and large, if you watched Mr. Kaufman in his congressional race, you saw it is incredibly difficult to decouple. You can criticize them and you're still drug along with him. So my sense is that, you know, he might criticize them, but he would get the blowback from criticism, and he does, you know, on a few things he'll get some separation, but by and large, I don't think he sees a net positive. Just my thought on him. Here are the current polls. And this is an August poll, so it's quite old, but Mr. Sanders was pretty much tied with Biden and Warren. Notice there are no favorite sons. There's no home state advantage. Hickenlooper and Bennett, Hickenlooper was out in that second poll. He'd moved over to the Senate. And it's true that Ms. Harris is not a front runner in California. She's maybe in 5th. So just in general, Beto was never particularly high up in Texas, and these races have become very nationalized right now. And believe me, those numbers will move they'll sort of flow with the national numbers. Although I do think, for example, Sanders has sort of a core vote here because in the last election, presidential election, 2016, he won the caucuses here. So he's got a core group here.
So, Floyd, you've been closer to these people than I would ever want to be, but I mean, if I'm Bennett, who we all like Bennett, and we're looking at August in Colorado, and he has 1% of the vote. Does that send a signal, maybe? I mean, you just mentioned he signed up in New Hampshire,
That's
where
right.
they always put two T's on his name.
His view is if he wins New Hampshire, he would then move up and be ahead in Colorado.
In Colorado?
Because
Okay,
it's
so,
because it's
all right,
nationalized.
yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
really his thinking, is that he needs lightning to strike.
Wow.
But he does believe that and I think he's probably correct, that the succeeding states are going to follow what happens in these earlier states to some extent. Notice there, by the way, is Fox News. Oh, did that make the president angry? That's that poll in which he went after Fox News, but it showed Biden and Warren and Sanders ahead of the president on October the 11th. Now there's the last state poll. It's back a ways in August. I don't think it's probably changed too much. Hickenlooper was 60%, and everybody else was, or the other three people that dropped out were polled at that point. But Mr. Beer and Madden and Walsh all dropped out. But one reason why I put that up there is because notice the pollster. It was a PPP, that robo-poll operation, which I think is out of North Carolina.
It's North Carolina.
It's Democratic in orientation, but they have a great track record, and I by and large watch it. They're very inexpensive. They do it by a reduced cost methodology. But notice in Denver, Hickenlooper was at 49%, which says to me that there's no big bifurcation between the more liberal wing of the party and the general party, which would be the first column. Or to put another way, Democrats want to win and not fight over the issues this time. That would be my guess. For those of you who are backing somebody else, my thought is that you have an uphill road there. Notice also that Hickenlooper is winning dramatically against Cory Gardner, about the same level as the president is losing. That's about the president's numbers here, about whoever they put in, Biden or whatever, is 52 and the president's 42. So notice unaffiliated, that guy has to scare you if you're Mr. Gardner. They're a huge group. They turn out in tremendous numbers, and you don't want to lose them by those numbers. So I think we've sort of laid out there where you can kind of understand the process that's going on right now.
Before we get
go
to
ahead.
Colorado, on the national map, the Democrats essentially need 4 seats. And
Senate, yes.
Senate.
Yeah.
And
right.
we're assuming the House stays the Democrat side.
Yes, I think so.
So to get the 4 seats, and this is important because not all the Supreme Court justices are, I mean, some of them are getting up there.
You got it. There will be some more retirements.
So this is fairly important. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd put it at about 100, I think. And so my question is, all right, so we see what's probably going to happen to Cory Gardner.
Right.
Notwithstanding Larry Sabato's prediction, I think Susan Collins is in trouble. I mean, it is New England. It is tends to be as democratic as it is Red Sox country. So, then there's North Carolina.
North
I'd be
Carolina,
interested.
Tillis is in trouble.
Tillis is in trouble.
I mean, it depends on the. I'm not sure who's going to emerge on the Democratic side. I think the quality of the candidate.
But Fritz, as you've said, North Carolina tends to be kind of a swing state. I mean, it did go to Obama. What I'm curious about is McSally. She was appointed, of course. This is a McCain seat. Do I have that right? Yeah. But she's up against the husband of Kelly. Yeah. And is he ahead? I mean, because I've never heard. I mean, if you have to rely on Arizona and you're Democrat, I mean, it just strikes me as. I mean, with due respect to Arizona, they do play spring baseball there. I like that, but I just don't see.
Let me ask Fritz. You noticed Kentucky just put in a close race, but nonetheless, Kentucky just put in a looks like a Democratic governor. Should Mitch be concerned at all?
No.
Okay,
I don't think so.
I agree. Well, the professionals right now think that there's probably
was
three.
just an
The
odd.
Democrats could make 3 seats. They don't see 4, but I think it by and large depends, like Chris is referencing, on how strong does the Democrat run. Because there are, as I mentioned to you, it's nationalized. There are coattails, and if he's winning by substantial majorities in some of these close states, I personally, I think North Carolina could definitely go. I think Florida would come into play at that point. I just think a lot of states would come into play that at the moment we're not. Iowa's potentially in play. I think Georgia could be in play. And it's a question of how does that Democrat do? Does he win enough to or she enough to have some coattails?
Just one more complication.
Yeah.
Of course, the net swing of 3 only matters if the Democrats also win the White House.
You got it. Because if there was a tie, it would be the vice
And
president.
why is Tillis in so much trouble?
He's just not a very effective guy. I mean, I
Well,
think
that's
it's
true of all of them. Right?
Yeah, but he. Yeah, it's not a good answer, is it? His poll numbers are really bad. And North Carolina is. I mean, there's a popular Democratic governor, popular Democratic Secretary of Attorney General. The state Supreme Court is now controlled by Democrats elected in North Carolina. You may have followed the state rulings on gerrymandering, which is going to transform the landscape of the state legislature. Right. So the momentum is very much with Democrats actually in North Carolina right now. But it's on it's really pretty evenly divided, and I really do think I don't know who will emerge on the Democratic side, but Tillis is he's just stumbled enough and there've been enough sort of scandals on the Republican side that the mood is not really good for him.
Okay, and I think the presidential will make a difference too. Notice the picture of 5 of our governors. Number 1, who's not in it? Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens led the opposition. How did they do? They won. Notice that we used to call Governor Lamb Governor Gloom. Is he still living up to that with that picture? He definitely looks gloomy there. I think they felt reasonably confident. I think they knew they were in a tough race, but it really slipped away from them, and they lost by 9 points. And they had a lot of advantages. They had that great ballot language that said without raising taxes, and they had about 2-to-1, better than 2-to-1 in money. Most of us thought that sports gaming was going to win. It just was surprisingly close. I was at Channel 9 during the night, and there was a while it was behind. So we were all.
Did you bet on it?
No, but you can't bet yet.
Oh, okay.
And then notice my Proposition C and Proposition D flow there. Proposition CC only won 12 counties. And for example, they won Boulder and Denver by very substantial numbers. You see that. The problem is they lost Jefferson and Douglas and El Paso, which I didn't put up here on this. This is Metro. They lost, obviously, Arapahoe and Adams. And most of those counties had much, much higher turnout. Denver had maybe 140,000. Jefferson had 190,000. El Paso had 170,000. And so they were just swamped by the turnout in, I think, Republican-leaning counties and the state generally that went for them. Notice Denver likes gaming, 63% there, so it passed. And it also passed in Larimer and in what I call the marijuana belt. That is to say, those counties on the western slope that voted overwhelmingly in 2012 to legalize cannabis, and you know where they are. You all go skiing there for the most part. It did well in those areas. And finally, let me just do a brief review of what we just went through quickly. My view is that there's going to be some surprises. There almost always is. We're just, whether it's in the primary or prior to the primary, there's going to be some surprises. No favorite sons. I'm still convinced the nominee will be in their 70s because the president's always got one side lined up. And I think I think there could be some movement there, but I think those three top people are still the people to look at. President's going to be indicted. I think there could be more than 50 votes for conviction. But there has to be 66 votes, and I don't see 20 Republicans moving to the Democratic side on that issue. But I argue, as per that map, that he can win. For those of you who are watching the World Series, he put up his first, or a very good ad, got a lot of positive comments on it. It was called the He's No Mr. Nice Guy ad. And that's essentially what he's arguing. He said, I know a lot of people don't like me. I'm not that nice a guy, but I'm getting X done and Y done. And it takes a mean guy to shake up Washington. And, that's an argument. You can see, I think that Cory Gardner is a very good politician. I think if this was a straight up race, he would be very competitive. I do think he has the problem with Trump. I mentioned the Democrats want a winner. Big money is going to be spent, major battle, no matter what the polls say. He will be up until the very end. I mean, if the polls are terrible in October, then the money will start to withdraw from here and go someplace else. But by and large, I see this staying very competitive. Record turnout. I didn't mention turnout because we have no idea how many people are going to turn out on March the 3rd. We've never had a presidential primary. Well, we had one in 2000, and very few people turned out, maybe 100,000 or 150,000. Could 600,000 Democrats and unaffiliates who now can vote in one of these primaries show up? That's how many showed up at the gubernatorial primary last year when we were sorting out whether it would be Polis or the rest of the people on the ballot, Mr. Johnson and others. And so it could be a huge number. We honestly don't know. I do think that in the election, we're going to see 3 million Coloradans turn out. We're going to have our record turnout. I put this down more than about a week and a half ago. I assumed Tabor was going to be very, very hard to beat. Didn't matter what polls said otherwise. It is just tough to beat because I think most people interpret it as a tax increase. The Republicans are overwhelmingly organized, and I think Bill Owens rallied them. By the way, we're going to, on the ballot next year, we'll be changing the Electoral College in Colorado, and that'll be another one of these polarizing issues that will activate the Republicans and potentially provide some additional controversy. That could be an entire seminar itself, on how the Electoral College works.
I'd just like to go through a couple of the foreign policy.
Yeah, let's shift gears
because,
and talk about foreign policy, and then we'll
because you click on your newspaper in the morning, and you might see a lot about Venezuela, and you might, in the back of your mind, sort of wonder, well, what does this mean, not only to us but to our election? And the answer is it could mean a lot, and it has to do with Florida. If you look at how many Venezuelans in the last 10, 15 years, when they got these left-wing, frankly, communist governments under Chavez, when that started, a lot of Venezuelans got up and left. They have tended to be Republican supporters. Now many of them are voting. They've earned their citizenship. And they have looked very carefully at how this administration has handled Venezuela. Well, you recall about 6 months ago, John Bolton essentially announced we're going to have a coup in Venezuela. And I can assure you a lot of this had to do with energizing this base in Florida, because it's not just the Venezuelans, the old line Cubans in Florida also feel this great sense of camaraderie with the Venezuelans, because this time it's a communist government in Venezuela, like the situation in Cuba. So they have tended to vote together. And when you see Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, pushing this whole thing and really getting the president to focus on Venezuela, this has to do with Florida elections. So the question is whether they are going to be successful in Venezuela, because despite everyone's expectation, it never happened this spring. It could still happen, nothing to do with John Bolton, not that he frankly could have done anything in the first place about it, but Venezuela could well the government there, which is one of the worst governments in the hemisphere, and there's a lot of competition for that, but that government could collapse, and Trump will get a lot of credit for that, and he'll get a lot of votes for that, an energized base in Florida. But the other thing going on in Florida to keep in mind is there are a lot of Puerto Ricans who are already American citizens, and they moved to Florida. So in a way, it's they moved because of the hurricane in Puerto Rico. The Venezuelans most recently moved because of the hurricane in their own country in terms of terrible governance. So the Florida demographics could really decide the whole race. And so when you see stories about Venezuela, read them carefully, because it really could impact what happens in terms of Florida. And as Florida goes, I think it's really the key state on this whole thing. The second thing is North Korea. Well, North Korea, take it from me, it's a dead loser. I mean, there's just nothing you can do about it. But as David Sanger was telling me, the New York Times guy, in fact, we've had him here in the past, he told me he was at a Trump rally, and he went around and he said to random people, you know, with MAGA hats, and, you know, how is the president doing in North Korea? And he said everybody he talked to randomly said, oh, he's fixed that. They've stopped it. There's no more problem in North Korea. Yeah. So now, Julie occasionally makes me go to Walmart to carry groceries. I did a similar thing in the Walmart checkout lane, and same kind of stuff. So here's the question. I mean, nothing has changed in North Korea. There's absolutely no change on the North Korean position. They are holding on to their nuclear weapons. But Trump has insisted no sanctions relief until we have a deal. And the North Koreans, they need the sanctions relief. The last set of sanctions, so-called sectoral sanctions, involved gasoline for North Korea, things that they really need. So the North Koreans are very happy with Trump, and I don't mean to taint him with, you know, he's got the North Korean vote sewn up, but they're happy with the fact that he showed them a lot of respect that no one else has. And so they would not mind seeing Donald Trump win the election. At the same time, they are very edgy people, and they may see that he needs this issue to remain quiescent, at least through the November 2020. And so they may say, because they think like mafia types, they think, you know, what's it worth to you? We can keep it quiet, but we really need some sanctions relief. We can do that quietly. We can work that out, but we really need that. Otherwise, we may have to call an end to this by the end of the year. And they've been talking about that, and the president simply doesn't know what to do, because frankly speaking, he's never known what to do about the North Koreans. So watch this space, because we may be in a situation where if they start testing again, and you remember testing is a subset of development. So they're getting to the point with these solid fuel rockets that they need more testing in order to make more progress. So there's pressure to test there. They may do that, and that's going to undermine his base in terms of, wait a minute, we thought this was solved. On the Kurdish thing, if you read the New York Times or Washington Post, you think this is the biggest catastrophe an administration could ever do to itself, to abandon a friend. And no question, abandoning a friend is frankly speaking, I mean, it's un-American. I mean, it's unbelievable. At the same time, if you look at polling data, the president gets a lot of credit for just saying endless wars versus quick wars, and I'm getting rid of endless wars. And so he's actually, you know, when you put aside the feelings about the Kurds, he's actually gotten a lot of credit for ending something that many people thought we would be in for a number of years. Now, he's also getting criticism because with Kurds come Yazidis, and all kinds of people. I mean, it's quite a thing there, and there are a lot of the evangelical Christians who feel a kinship to this whole, these various peoples on the northern, or the Turkish and Iraq and Turkish-Syrian border. So it's not a slam dunk winner for him, but people need to understand that from his point of view, the courageous decision to end endless wars, he's getting a lot of credit for that. On Iran, I think the Iranians are basically saying, you want to run away from that deal, we're going to make you pay for it. And so Iran is very carefully never moving up to the point of war because they know the president doesn't want that. He doesn't want to be dropping bombs on another country in the Middle East. But the Iranians are kind of putting the president in a situation where you can legitimately say, now what did we get out of walking out of the agreement, the JCPOA? And the Iranians are smart enough to pull this out. I was, a month and a half ago, I met the Korbel graduate, Javad Zarif, and Zarif told me there's a deal on the table. We've agreed to it, and Macron told us, the French president again, told us that Trump has agreed to it. But Trump has insisted that the Iranians have to meet with him at the end of the meeting, at the end of which he will say, okay, we'll drop the sanctions, and then there are a bunch of other things that go along with that. And the Iranians have said, no, we're not going to do that, because at the end of the meeting, you may just say, okay, I got to go call Sean Hannity and make my... so the Iranians are not taking a chance on this. So I don't think that agreement's going to come together unless the Iranians keep putting this pressure, and we saw another example on their enrichment, where the president essentially has to either step up the pressure, which he doesn't want to do, reference the getting rid of endless wars, he's going to have to do something. So again, watch the Iran stuff very carefully. As for Brexit, it's just a comforting thought that they are even dumber than we are. So, and I think overall, he has an interest in calming down some of these fires that he lit, especially on issues like on the trade issues with China. The Chinese, though, may not be so anxious to help him out. They are getting hurt by it. I mean, they are, you know, you have to take with a grain of salt some of their growth rates, but they are down about 50% of their growth rate. They're calling it 6%. It's probably less. And they have an interest in solving this and settling this, but they don't have an interest in creating a circumstance where it's a great victory for him. And I must say, when I was in China in, I can't remember, end of February or end of September, a lot of them were saying, you know, we were all in favor of trying to deal with this. But then when he solved the Mexican problem and 2 weeks later slapped on additional tariffs on Mexico over that is Trump's view that Mexico is not doing enough about migration issues, about having Guatemalans, et cetera, come through Mexico. They should have done more to stop them. He put tariffs back on. And a number of Chinese told me, they said, we just don't trust him. And so we're kind of reluctant to do any broad deals.
Don't you think, Chris, the Chinese at this point are, you know, they may be suffering economically, but they kind of like that the U.S. is fading here. And, you know, you saw a statement by Macron about the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Accord. Where was Macron? He was in Beijing.
Yeah.
You know, and the Chinese, you know, kind of, at least part of what they like is the decline of America. They're willing to suffer some economic consequences.
And suffering consequences, going through, you know, long marches for no apparent reason and stuff like this. When you have countries with national narratives at the heart of which is national suffering, don't think you can out-suffer them. And so, absolutely, we've got to be careful. So it's a very mixed picture out there. And the trouble with the president on this is, I mean, we don't have time to speak diplomatically. He doesn't understand any of this stuff. So he's got to turn to people who do, and frankly, he doesn't have anyone who does.
Thank you for that summary there.
Other than that, it's going great. So
I was going to make one comment on his the point that was referenced on how this could affect him diplomatically, for example, or domestically. For example, some crisis in North Korea that looks like he's not handling very well, or Iran, et cetera. And we have a rally effect as a concept in public opinion that when something dramatic happens, particularly in foreign policy, but something dramatic happens, we tend to rally sort of patriotically toward our president, toward the leader. And you saw it after 9/11, for example. You saw a small rally after Osama bin Laden was killed. You saw none after Baghdadi. And it's because that survey I put up there, remember I mentioned it's in a very tight frame. It simply doesn't, bad news doesn't seem to affect him too much, and good news doesn't seem to help him very much. You know, we all sit around and say, well, the economy could hurt him if it goes south, because obviously it's been pretty good by some indicators. But there's sort of a debate on that as to whether or not that's normal. That's normally what would happen. If you have a recession, you have a president that's probably going to an incumbent who's in deep, deep trouble. Is that true with Trump? Probably, but maybe not. Who knows? Again, he's got this base. They'll probably say that it's going well. Because he has, as you know, 43 million people on his Twitter feed. He has Fox News. He has a variety of sort of alternative news operations out there, and I mean really alternative.
There could be a tipping point when you've turned the Republican Party into the party that's opposed to trade. You've turned the Republican Party into the party that's opposed to deficits. You know, he's added $1 trillion to the deficit. Now, I think the economics profession will be the first to admit they have not quite understood the relationship of, you know, public sector borrowing and deficits and therefore inflation. I mean, it's far more complex than I think we all thought when we read Samuelson. But I think it's pretty clear that a lot of traditional Republican things have gone by the boards. Now, Cheney once said, hey, deficits don't really matter anymore. And so that was the kind of first indication that the Republicans were not going to care that much about deficits. But it's this whole onslaught against a Republican self-image that could at some point involve a tipping point.
It could. I think the question there, I mean, as has been said, if there were a private secret poll among members of Congress, even in the Republican Party, they don't love Trump, but they're afraid of him, and that base is pretty darn stable. I mean, I don't think he's yet shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, but we're gonna find out. One of the striking things about this impeachment thing, I've seen some of the polls. You just point out, there's not a lot of movement here, and that's been the case for a long time. But if you look at I saw a couple of polls where they asked people not just whether you support, but whether you strongly support or one of the other candidates. And what you see is further polarization. So you see on both sides strongly support and strongly oppose the president went up. And it feels like it's just, obviously there's some people in the middle, but that middle is pretty darn small, and it is pretty, pretty locked in.
Just on that, and it dovetails into what you said, are there some Republicans that could walk away from this? We were discussing earlier today that we all know Republicans, some of whom are now registered unaffiliated in this state because it's relatively easy to do. But are Republicans, they voted for Trump or maybe for Kasich, but they're really, really struggling with this. And that's the group, and I'd say it's maybe 20% of that, that 85% that backs the president when you would do those polls. Obviously, there's some that are not, but there's about 20% of even those committed people that are soft, for them, the question is the alternative, which goes to something you talk about a lot, and that is that the Democrats have to have this process, hopefully for them, will sort this out and come up with somebody that truly can compete in those particularly with those Republicans or Republican-leaning voters, but also in those key states.
I know we need to go to Q&A.
We should probably open up.
But I just have one crass, self-serving comment I'd like to make, which is, democracy, it's not just about elections. We all know it's about institutions. But to say a democracy is about institutions really doesn't explain it, because institutions are no better than the people who are in those institutions. And when I look at my Foreign Service colleagues, like Masha Yovanovitch, Bill Taylor, Phil Reeker, I mean, all these guys going up to the Senate and telling the truth makes me feel very, very positive about our country's capacity to withstand these things.
Amen. Well, why don't we open up for
And we have
questions
a
here?
microphone
All
here.
right, so we
Why
have
don't
a
take this
microphone.
right in
that'll
front
walk-
here. We'll start right in front,
Yep,
sort of move
that's
back.
great.
Before you get away, what's the path to candidacy for Mr. Bloomberg?
Bloomberg.
Oh, Bloomberg.
'Cause he
that's,
just-
that's like news today, right?
Yeah.
You're on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, he has one major advantage, like Mr. Steyer, an incredible amount of money. Is he talking about being in the Democratic primary, or is he talking about running as an independent?
No.
Independent?
Democrat, and he's registered in Alabama. And, Steyer's never been a mayor of New York for 12 years, so I would say he has another advantage. But I think the prevailing view seems to be too little, too late.
Hard.
Yeah.
And I think I think there was a place, he dropped out. There was a place for him. It's turned out to be this moderate lane, which Biden now dominates. But I just think it's very hard to get in this race at this point. We shall see. Another one of those surprises, absolutely. Somebody else, right there, go ahead, that lady there.
Florida. I believe that President Obama won it twice. My question for you is there any possibility, particularly if Broward County could possibly get their act together, that we could pull Florida back into the Democratic camp?
Now, when you say he won it twice, you mean like in 2018 they won the governorship?
No, I'm sorry. President Obama won it in 2008,
President Obama.
2012.
Got it,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it ought to be a swing state. I think the thing that we're all looking at, along with some polls that show it's either very close or leaning for Trump at the moment, is what happened in 2018. It surprised all of us. I think a lot of people thought that the Democrats could pick up the governorship and hold that Senate seat.
I think African Americans stayed home because of Hillary Clinton. I don't think they really believed in her. And I think, someone like Biden, who has always pulled well with African Americans,
That's what the New York Times
Yeah.
poll showed, that
Yeah.
Biden wins. It's early, soft, etc. He does better than the other two leading Democratic
I would
candidates
I would
in
agree with that, and
Florida.
I definitely think it could be won. Next person, somebody out there. Yeah, that sounds good.
There were two words that I did not hear, and those two words were Russia and Putin. And I'm wondering if you want to
All
reflect on
roads
whether
lead to
those are no longer a big factor, or was it just an oversight?
Well, I like to believe that our law enforcement agencies are up to this challenge, and I think state election authorities are also up to the challenge. So I don't see any sort of retail theft of actual votes. Where you see issues of, is in this social media space, et cetera. I don't see the Russians backing down from that, but there do seem to be even some rules in the social media space. And so I don't think the Russians are, if they are successful again, it will be by other means than the ones they chose in 2016. So I think we are ready for the last war. The question is whether there's a new set of challenges that we're not ready for. I must say, I find it utterly appalling about the president's attitude to Russia. And by the way, this fed into the Ukraine issue as well.
Completely, yeah.
Very significantly into Ukraine. And that a question, Chris, was that you were citing places that could become a crisis that would damage him if Russia did something in Ukraine over the current level of tension. Does he get blamed for that? Does it sort of dovetail into the fact that he hasn't been committed to the Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I think when you start disaggregating some of the stuff he's done, for example, he's really, even though there's widespread attitude that he is favorable to Russia, especially with respect to Ukraine, and this kind of hurt him in the Polish community. But on the other hand, he just gave Poland the visa waiver program, meaning that he's suggested that Poland had so few number of visa refusals, that now Poles don't need to have visas when they come to the States. I mean, that's a new one on me. Julie and I were at a Polish event in Washington, and I said, look, I'm not surprised they joined NATO. I'm not surprised they got into the European Union. I'm kind of amazed that we gave them the visa waiver program, and it suggests that the president is very aware that he needs these kinds of classic ethnic voters in places like Michigan. So
They also have a sort of a very nationalistic government at the moment, and aren't we going to have Camp Trump there, where we'll put a few troops?
yeah, I mean, we have not accepted it as Camp Trump. I think he has, but I think the fact is that you know, a lot of the support for this Law and Justice Party in Poland, very kind of hardline nationalist party, it comes from kind of Polish American voters you might see in Cleveland or Detroit. They don't necessarily, when they do these overseas polls, those POLLSs, they tend to be kind of supportive of Kaczynski and these people. So the president has gone very easy on those guys. He's also gone very easy on Orban because in Hungary, because you know, a lot of Hungarians in the U.S. don't mind seeing a guy who's kind of tough, and you know, frankly, Hungary is doing pretty well economically. So I don't think he feels he's paid any price for not being tough on the Polish or Hungarian governments, and so I think it'll continue.
Somebody over here? Go ahead.
I'm just curious how you are conducting your polls now in the days of the sinking landlines, which are nobody
Right.
has anymore, and also, are you capturing any of the millennial voters in your polling?
You know, good question. We did a number of surveys this summer at essentially the county level. At that level, phones are still the way to go. You call people. You call them on their cell phone. You call them on the few that have landlines left. By and large, I'd say 70 or 80% of people now are picked up on cell phones. You get them off of voter registration lists. So it's still, I think it's still an accurate methodology here in whether it's in smaller communities or even in statewide. But many of the polls I cited are panel polls now. I mentioned the PPP, a robo-poll that uses automatic dialing. The panel polls are, from my opinion, they're good, but you always have sort of a grain of salt concerning it, because the panel has to be well designed. It has to be randomly selected. Many of them are not. They're more marketing type of panels. So I think we're going to have to be very cautious as consumers of polls over the next several months. The National Association, the New York Times, the people that are publishing these polls, even RealClearPolitics.com, they are using a pretty good scan, high criteria. You have to be very transparent. You have to use good methodology. But phoning, all the national polls I cited to you, from all of the big papers, including that Fox poll, including CNN, et cetera, they're still calling people. And including, you mentioned millennials. Absolutely. Now, you keep in mind, in this election, you could have oversampled millennials because they didn't particularly show up. You'll see, I think they were about 10% of the final electorate, and they should have been maybe 20% if you just went on their existence in the population. On the other hand, they showed up overwhelmingly in 2018 in this state. They gave that huge push that put Mr. Cory Gardner out of office and gave so much help to Jared Polis. So there they were incredibly important, and if you hadn't polled them, you would have missed some of the Democratic sweep at that point. So yes, we're definitely picking them up, but there are times when they don't participate very much. Somebody back there.
As we go forward month by month, can you help us understand how to continue to evaluate the Democratic potentials? And for example, is there any way that this country has an appetite for a woman president? Is there any way this country has an appetite for a younger president?
Excuse me.
And is there any way for the Democrats to appeal to uneducated voters?
Wow.
Yes. Let me just mention, and then let me get Fritz in here because he knows a lot about this, that look at both, check out my website, but if you look at these slides, and these slides will be available, they'll be public for you. I cite the sources that you can look to on a regular basis that are publishing data on the primary, et cetera. Then your more granular questions, or your what we would call sort of your cross-tabulation questions, and that is looking down inside of the data from maybe a Democratic point of view. There are, not only is a lot of the data published, including from these big polls that you could look at, but there is so much analysis going on right now from a host of websites that are quite good. One called the Polling Report that publish questions just exactly like that. Are the Democrats going to be able to talk to the white, working class, less than college educated voter? And how are they going to do that? And how important are they? Et cetera, et cetera. So definitely that, I would say that we are inundated with information like that. You know, we all kind of thought for a while after the polls had their miss in 2016 that maybe the big polling operations, particularly the media outlets, would pull back. Au contraire. If anything, they have committed even more resources to polling because they think that, number one, this is incredibly important. Number two, they still have confidence in the methodology, and they all have their own survey teams themselves. And finally, they know that you can't answer the kind of questions you had unless you do have polling. It is really the only way to do it. Fritz.
Well, I would add to that, you know, it's catnip. I mean, we love polls. We love, you know, it's you get clicks and you get eyeballs on. So, you know, that's the real driver. They love it. And they're just, you know, they're not all that discriminating in terms of the quality of the polls. In fact, they like an outlier poll because it's a bigger headline, even if it's, you know, not true. I think on you know, you had several questions there. I mean, the question of whether America's ready to elect a woman president. Well, the answer is we don't really know. We haven't done that. You know, clearly Hillary Clinton faced some headwinds and was treated differently. I think it's the case that women politicians face somewhat different standards. But that wasn't her only problem, probably. And Elizabeth Warren is a formidable candidate. It's hard to know whether, you know, the extent to which gender is an inhibitor or whether the price tag of I don't know if you saw that again, the New York Times today, an incredible graphic showing, you know, the price tag of all of the things that she says she's going to do, which, by the way, it turns out you got to get them passed by the Congress, and so she's probably not going to be able to do them. But so it's hard to sort that out. I mean, I think we're still evolving in that regard. My own view was that the right woman candidate could certainly win. Whether she is that is hard to say. On uneducated voters, I mean, the single clearest predictor of your voting patterns right now is the level of education. It's incredible how strong that is. In fact, you can go state by state, and if you look at the percentage of people with higher education degrees by state, you can predict almost precisely which are red and blue states.
Which is why we've got to be very careful in polling. One of the things they think we missed in Wisconsin and Michigan and Western Pennsylvania is exactly that they undersampled people with less than a college education. 2 years is the criteria they use. And so that is definitely a big issue.
You know, can a Democrat or more liberal candidate appeal to people with less education? They have done so in the past. I mean, I think, you know, the Trump message, you know, MAGA is pretty, simple to get. It's a very simple story. He tells very simple stories, a consistent narrative, whereas President Obama was, more like us, kind of professorial, he's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, and, it's complicated.
But he carried a lot of blue-collar voters,
he did, but I do think there was even, and I picked on him because he was successful, all right, so, but Hillary, I think Elizabeth Warren suffers some of the same thing. There's a level of kind of, I know better than you that comes across that I think is off-putting for a lot of people, and Democrats have been guilty of being pretty tone-deaf along the way. So.
I think, I mean, if I could just make a comment, sort of unencumbered by any knowledge on the subject, I think it's a very serious problem because the elections tend to be so close, they're on the margin, and so you can never, the polling data for all the problems you've outlined, I mean, notwithstanding all the computerizations of, left-handed knuckleball pitchers tend to vote Democrat, something like that. But I mean, the problem is, I think the elections are so close. The polling, as I understand, to get a voter on a cell phone, you have to make 12 tries until someone finally picks up and listens to you. I mean, this has got to be a diminution of what we had, say, 25 years ago. I mean, so I think it's a very serious problem, and I don't think there's, this is a case where information cannot substitute for knowledge, and frankly, knowledge is not going to substitute for wisdom. I think people really need to think this through. We know from the Hillary campaign there's an excessive reliance on some of these metrics, and the metrics proved to be wrong on the margin. So I think the problem is the closeness of the races.
Yep.
I agree. I think this may be, I say this fairly regularly, that this may be the last election with lots of telephoning, and we'll end up going to panels. As you know, I still have some reservations with that, but it just sort of seems like the direction we're going. A question over on this side. He's moving back.
So mine is a two-part question. So the first is, I think somebody talked about Florida. Isn't it true that the last election they had in ballot box where probably 1 million former felons are now eligible to vote? So what impact that might have? And the other question is, no offense to people from Iowa or Ambassador Hill, New England, or why are we still stuck with the Iowa-New Hampshire model? Because it doesn't seem to me a good representation of what the country is really about today.
You don't think a few caucus goers are a great predictor for?
It's tradition, It's a hard thing to change, but it's a great point, I think, on the Iowa and New Hampshire. They're not representative states.
There's been a lot of debate about that, but as Fritz says, it is tradition. It's also every time the Democrats have looked at changing that, it has caused so much controversy. They've just decided to let it go, put some rules around it that there can only be those 4, and that then things really start on March the 3rd. So they've tried to rein it in because a lot of people were even jumping earlier than the Super Tuesday.
And I think they're less important than they once were. I mean, it used to be the case if you did badly in Iowa or New Hampshire, you were done. I mean, Lyndon Johnson quit because
we've gotten a lot more sophisticated.
He didn't win by enough.
I agree, and we just know the demographics of the area, and so we're more sophisticated about it. On the question about Florida, I'm not an expert on it, but I was listening to NPR the other day, and they said that the governor has now passed, I think they've passed a law, a statutory law, that said, however, before you can vote as a felon, you must pay all of your past fines and court costs. Well, most people don't know what they are. Most people couldn't afford that. So now there's a suit on that. But I believe at the moment there's a stay on their voting. I'm not sure. I think so.
Yeah, I think it's
the overall numbers in Florida are about 50-50 Dems and Republicans. What's not 50-50 is what goes on in the state legislatures and in their congressional caucus. So a lot of it has to do with just out-and-out gerrymandering of the worst kind. And I think that is an issue that our country needs to start taking on directly, and maybe before this next census.
It started to. I mean, you saw Virginia's already done that. Watch North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the most gerrymandered states. the court cases have now thrown out both the State House and the congressional district. They'll be redrawn. Who knows what the maps will look like, but if they're fairer, they'll be a more even outcome, and that'll be dramatic change.
We've got time for maybe one more question. The gentleman right here in the front row has had his hand up for a while. Oh,
Thank you. Just two things. One, no, I don't hear ever being discussed is that you have to have an educated populace in order for a democracy to work. And Republicans have been working very hard for the last 40 years to dumb down the electorate. You know, look at fake news. You can tell a Trump person that is a red flower, and it will become red to him. That's our biggest problem. We have people who are not. I'm trying to think what word to use here. They don't understand what truth is and what reality is.
Well,
I mean, you have a
if-
man
yeah.
that said he's going to grab a woman by her private parts, and women are still voting for him. The religious groups are still voting for him.
Well, it's not.
Where are we going to get educated
It's not clear
people?
that that there was a golden age where everyone was educated.
No, but they didn't vote.
I worked for Bill Bradley, who was very thoughtful guy, and therefore was doomed to fail as a presidential candidate. But he would always tell a story on himself, which actually goes back to Adlai Stevenson, who was a very thoughtful, erudite person, gave a wonderful speech. And one woman came up to him afterwards and said, Senator, that was wonderful. You have the vote of every thinking person in America. He said, "Ma'am, that's not enough. I need a majority." So that's been there. Is it worse now? I don't know. I mean, I do think the media landscape is so different.
I think that's a
now.
key issue.
And it's almost as if we're sort of in gossip circles at this point, where rumors and things feed on these conspiracy theories, and I don't think it's symmetric. So I don't, but there's some of it on both sides, to be sure. But that's a huge problem. I mean, I think as human beings, it's easy to believe the simple story. We just like simple stories that reinforce our prior beliefs. It's harder to sort of take the time. It's like hard work to sort out what the heck's going on in Syria or North Korea or the Kurds. I mean, who are all those people you're talking about? It's hard work, and so we love those simple stories. So when you have an environment, media environment that feeds that, I think it does contribute to kind of dumbing down the populace in that regard.
So we're going to meet a year from now?
We're
What
going to
is
set
it?
it up
We're
for a
gonna do
year
it
from
again?
now. Everybody
Yeah.
put it on your calendars. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Floyd. Thank you, Chris. We'll see what happens. It's going to be, one thing's for sure, it's going to be a busy year. So, thank you.
Thank you, Fritz.
Thank you. Good job.